The Mgrim Experiment. What's the line between personal conscience and obedience to authority? Is there a point where the human spirit refuses to follow an order it knows is wrong? In 1961, a Yale University psychologist named Stanley Mgrim decided to find out, and his results would cast a long, dark shadow over our understanding of human nature. The context was critical. The world was still grappling with the horrors of the Holocaust, and the Nuremberg trials had been dominated by the chillingly simple defense of Nazi officers, "I was just following orders." Mgrim wanted to test that claim. He wanted to know if the capacity for such evil was a uniquely German trait, or if the right circumstances could turn anyone into a monster. He devised an experiment disguised as a study on memory and learning. Participants, all ordinary people from New Haven, Connecticut, were assigned the role of teacher. Their task was to administer electric shocks to a learner in another room every time the learner made a mistake on a word pair test. The electric generator in front of them was a terrifying piece of stagecraft, with switches ranging from 15 volts, labeled slight shock, all the way to 450 volts, marked with a grim XXX. With each error, the teacher was instructed to increase the voltage. Here's the catch. The learner was an actor, and the shocks were fake, but the teacher didn't know that. As the voltage climbed, the actor began to play his part with terrifying conviction. At 120 volts, he shouted that the shocks were becoming painful. At 150, he demanded to be let out of the experiment. At 300, he screamed in agony and complained of a heart condition. After 330 volts, there was only an eerie silence from the other room. Throughout this ordeal, if a teacher hesitated, a man in a gray lab coat, the experiment's authority figure, would deliver a series of 4 prods, each more insistent than the last. "Please continue. The experiment requires that you continue. It is absolutely essential that you continue. You have no other choice. You must go on." Before the experiment, Mgrim polled his colleagues. They predicted that maybe 1% of participants, the most sadistic fringe, would go all the way to 450 volts. The reality was sickening. A staggering 65% of the teachers, 2 out of every 2 ordinary people, obeyed the man in the lab coat and administered the final massive 450-volt shock. They were visibly distressed, sweating, trembling, stuttering, some even breaking into fits of nervous laughter, but they kept flipping the switches. The Mgrim experiment revealed a terrifying truth. The just following orders defense wasn't an excuse, it was a fundamental feature of human psychology. The power of a perceived legitimate authority can be so immense that it overrides our deepest moral convictions. We're not born monsters, but the right combination of authority and ideology can make us act like them. The evil wasn't in the participants, it was in the situation Mgrim had created. The Stanford Prison Experiment. What happens when you strip away identity and assign people roles of power and powerlessness? How much of your self is innate, and how much is just a script you follow based on the uniform you're wearing? In 1971, psychologist Philip Zimbardo set out to answer this question. His experiment would become so infamous, so ethically controversial, that it could never be repeated. He built a mock prison in the basement of the Stanford University Psychology Building and recruited 24 mentally healthy, well-adjusted male college students. They were randomly assigned to be either a prisoner or a guard for a 2-week simulation. The transformation was immediate and chilling. The guards were given khaki uniforms, reflective sunglasses to conceal their eyes, and wooden batons. The prisoners were stripped, deloused, and forced to wear ill-fitting smocks with no underwear, with a stocking cap to simulate a shaved head and a chain locked around one ankle. They were no longer individuals, they were numbers. The guards were given one simple instruction: maintain order. They were given no specific training, only absolute power. What unfolded was a masterclass in the psychology of tyranny. Within 24 hours, the roles became reality. The guards, many of whom had described themselves as pacifists, began to exhibit sadistic and authoritarian behavior. They devised cruel and unusual punishments, forcing prisoners to do push-ups with guards' feet on their backs, refusing them access to the toilet, and waking them in the middle of the night for pointless counts. They used psychological tactics, pitting prisoners against each other, revoking privileges arbitrarily, and enforcing mindless rules to break their spirits. The prisoners, in turn, internalized their roles of helplessness. Some rebelled on the second day, barricading themselves in their cells, but the guards quickly crushed the uprising with fire extinguishers. After that, the prisoners became increasingly passive, docile, and emotionally broken. They showed signs of severe emotional disturbance, depression, and anxiety. One prisoner had to be released after just 36 hours due to uncontrollable screaming and rage. The experiment, planned for 2 weeks, was terminated after only 6 days. Zimbardo, who was acting as the prison superintendent, realized he had become so absorbed in his own role that he had lost his scientific objectivity. It took an outside observer, his then-girlfriend Christina Maslach, to see the horror for what it was and demand he shut it down. The Stanford prison experiment demonstrated the terrifying power of the situation. It proved that the line between good and evil is not fixed, but permeable. The environment, the uniform, and the role can be enough to make good people do terrible things and to make strong people crumble. The Bystander Effect. On March 13, 1964, a young woman named Kitty Genovese was brutally murdered on her way home in Queens, New York. The initial report in the New York Times was sensational and horrifying. It claimed that 38 of her neighbors had witnessed the attack, which occurred over a half-hour period, but not a single one had called the police. While later investigations revealed the details were more complex and the number of witnesses exaggerated, the story ignited a firestorm of public debate and sparked a new field of psychological inquiry. The central question was agonizing: why did nobody help? Psychologist Bibb Latané and John Darley were determined to find an answer. They designed a series of ingenious experiments to simulate emergencies and observe how people reacted. In one, a student participant was placed in a cubicle and told they would be part of a group discussion about college life, communicating via an intercom. Suddenly, one of the other participants, an actor, would simulate having a violent epileptic seizure, choking and begging for help before falling silent. The key variable was the number of other people the participant believed were listening. When the participant thought they were the only other person in the group, 85% of them rushed to get help. But when they believed there were 4 other listeners, that number plummeted to just 31%. In another more visceral experiment, participants were put in a room to fill out a questionnaire. Suddenly, smoke would begin to pour into the room through a vent. Lone participants almost always reported the smoke calmly and quickly. But when a participant was in a room with 2 passive actors who were instructed to notice the smoke and then completely ignore it, the results were shocking. In 75% of these cases, the real participant simply sat there, continuing with their questionnaire as the room filled with smoke, casting confused glances at the others, but never acting. These studies gave a name to the phenomenon, the bystander effect. The grim irony is that the more people who witness an emergency, the less likely it is that any single one of them will intervene. The reason is a psychological mechanism called diffusion of responsibility. When you are the only witness, 100% of the responsibility to act rests on your shoulders. But when there are 10 witnesses, you feel only 10% of the responsibility. Everyone assumes someone else will call the police, someone else is more qualified to help, or, as the smoke-filled room showed, that the lack of reaction from others indicates it's not really an emergency at all. There is no safety in numbers. Sometimes there is only paralysis. The Ash Conformity Experiments. Imagine a simple vision test. You're shown one line, and next to it, 3 comparison lines labeled A, B, and C. Your task is to say which of the 3 lines is the same length as the target line. The answer is painfully obvious. It's a task a child could complete without error. Now, imagine you're performing this task in a group of 7 other people. One by one, they give their answers aloud before it's your turn. For the first couple of rounds, everyone agrees on the obvious correct answer. Then, on the third round, something strange happens. The first person gives a clearly wrong answer, then the second, then the third, fourth, fifth, sixth, and seventh. All of them agree on the same incorrect line. Now it's your turn. What do you say? Do you trust the evidence of your own eyes, or do you go along with the group? This was the elegant and powerful setup for the Ash Conformity Experiments, conducted by psychologist Solomon Ash in the 1950s. He wanted to measure the extent to which social pressure from a majority group could affect a person's judgment. All the other participants in the room were, of course, actors, instructed to give unanimously wrong answers on 12 out of the 18 trials. The results were a stunning demonstration of the power of conformity. A full 75% of participants conformed to the group's wrong answer at least once. While most didn't conform on every single trial, about a third of the participants conformed on half of the trials or more. In the control group, where participants judged the lines alone, they were correct more than 99% of the time. The pressure of the group was causing people to deny the unambiguous evidence of their own senses. When interviewed afterward, the participants gave two main reasons for their conformity. Some experienced what's called informational conformity. They genuinely came to believe that the group must be right and that their own perception was flawed. More common, however, was normative conformity. These participants knew the group was wrong, but they went along with it anyway. They were afraid of being ridiculed, of being seen as peculiar, of being the lone dissenter. The desire to fit in, to be accepted by the group, was so powerful that it made them publicly state something they privately knew to be false. The experiment reveals that much of what we call reality is in fact a social consensus, and the pressure to uphold that consensus can be overwhelming. The Robber's Cave Experiment. How do you create prejudice? Is it something learned in the home, or is it an inherent part of human nature? Social psychologist Muzaffar Sharif believed the answer was simpler and far more disturbing. He argued that prejudice, conflict, and even hatred could be systematically generated between any two groups simply by making them compete for the same resources. To prove it, he conducted the now legendary Robber's Cave Experiment in 1954. The setting was a 200-acre Boy Scout camp in Oklahoma. Sharif recruited 22 well-adjusted 11-year-old white Protestant boys from similar middle-class backgrounds. None of them knew each other. They were split into two groups and taken to separate areas of the park. For the first week, each group was left to bond, unaware of the other's existence. They worked together, swam together, and chose names for themselves, the Eagles and the Rattlers. A strong in-group identity formed quickly. Then, in Phase 2, Sharif brought the groups into contact for the first time, in the context of a multi-day tournament of competitive, zero-sum games. The prize for the winning team was a trophy and brand-new pocket knives for every member. The losers would get nothing. The effect was instantaneous and dramatic. The groups became hostile. It started with verbal abuse and name-calling. Then it escalated. The Eagles burned the Rattlers' flag. The Rattlers retaliated by raiding the Eagles' cabin, flipping beds, and stealing their belongings. The two groups refused to eat in the same room. When asked to describe the members of the other group, they used derogatory terms, while describing their own group members as brave and friendly. Sharif had successfully manufactured a microcosm of war. This demonstrated his realistic conflict theory, that intergroup hostility arises from competition for scarce resources. But the experiment had a third, more hopeful phase. Sharif then tried to reverse the hatred he had created. He first tried simple, non-competitive contact, like watching movies together, but the hostility remained. The only thing that worked was introducing superordinate goals, urgent problems that required both groups to cooperate to solve. He secretly sabotaged the camp's water supply and broke down the truck used to get food. Faced with a common enemy, the boys began to work together. The name-calling stopped, and friendships began to form across group lines. By the end of the camp, they were choosing to ride home on the same bus, sharing candy bought with money they had won together. The experiment showed not only how easily conflict can be created, but also provided a blueprint for how it can be resolved through shared goals and common humanity. The monster study. Can words create a disability? Can a simple label from an authority figure permanently alter a child's development? This was the horrifying question at the heart of a 1939 experiment conducted at the University of Iowa by Wendell Johnson. The experiment was so unethical, its results so damning, that it was concealed for over 60 years, known to insiders only as the monster study. Johnson's primary research interest was the cause of stuttering. He held a controversial theory that stuttering was not a genetic or neurological condition, but a learned behavior caused by a child's anxiety about normal speech disfluencies. To test this, he and his graduate student Mary Tudor conducted an experiment on 22 children at a nearby orphanage. 10 of the children had been identified by staff as stutterers. 12 were fluent speakers. The children were split into two groups. The first group, the control, was told their speech was fine and they were given positive encouragement. The second group, the experimental group, was subjected to a brutal form of negative conditioning. The fluent speakers in this group were told that they were not speaking correctly, that they were showing signs of a stutter, and that they must not speak unless they could do it right. The children in this group who already had a stutter were told in no uncertain terms that their speech was terrible and that they were confirmed stutterers. The results were catastrophic. The children who received positive therapy showed improvement or no change, but the children who were negatively labeled suffered profound and lasting damage. Several of the fluent-speaking orphans who were told they had a stutter developed the very speech problems they were accused of having. They became withdrawn, self-conscious, and reluctant to speak. Their grades fell. The children who already stuttered and were told they were hopeless cases saw their speech problems become dramatically worse. The monster study provided powerful evidence for Johnson's theory, but at an unforgivable human cost. The psychological damage inflicted on these vulnerable children followed many of them for the rest of their lives. When the study was finally uncovered decades later, the University of Iowa publicly apologized and the state paid a substantial settlement to the surviving participants. The monster study stands as a grim testament to the incredible power of labeling and suggestion. It proves that the words of an authority figure can become a self-fulfilling prophecy, shaping a person's reality and potential in ways that are both profound and, in this case, profoundly destructive. The learned helplessness experiment. What does it take to make a living creature give up? Not just give up on a task, but give up on the very idea of trying. In 1967, psychologists Martin Seligman and Stephen Meyer stumbled upon a powerful and deeply unsettling psychological phenomenon while conducting experiments on dogs. They weren't trying to study despair, they were studying classical conditioning. But what they found would redefine our understanding of depression, trauma, and resilience. The experiment involved 3 groups of dogs placed in individual harnesses. The first group, the control, was simply placed in the harness for a period and then released. The second group was subjected to electric shocks, but had a way to stop them. They could press a lever with their nose, which would end the current. They quickly learned they had control over their situation. The third group was the crucial one. They were yoked to the dogs in the second group, so they received a shock of the exact same intensity and duration, but their lever did nothing. The shocks seemed to come and go at random, completely outside of their control. The real test came in the next phase. Each dog was individually placed in a shuttle box, a large box with a low barrier in the middle. A light would come on, and 10 seconds later, a shock would be administered to the floor on one side of the box. The dog could easily escape the shock simply by jumping over the low barrier to the other side. The dogs from the first and second groups, the ones who had no shocks or controllable shocks, behaved as you'd expect. They quickly learned to jump the barrier as soon as the light came on, avoiding the shock altogether. But the dogs from the third group, the ones who'd experienced uncontrollable shocks, did something heartbreaking. When the light came on and the floor became electrified, most of them didn't even try to escape. They just lay down on the electrified grid and whimpered, enduring the pain without resistance, even though freedom was just a small hop away. Seligman and Meyer had discovered learned helplessness. They had taught these dogs that nothing they did mattered, that pain was inescapable. This lesson was so powerful that it carried over into a new situation where they did have control. They had learned to be helpless. The implications for human psychology were immense. The experiment provided the first powerful model for understanding why people can become passive and resigned in the face of trauma, abuse, or systemic failure. It showed that the belief that you have no control can become a cage more powerful than any physical barrier. The smoke-filled room experiment. You're sitting in a room, calmly filling out a survey. Suddenly, you notice smoke starting to billow from a vent in the wall. It's thin at first, but it's getting thicker. What do? The answer seems obvious. You get up, you investigate, you get out, you tell someone. Your survival instincts kick in. But what if you weren't alone? What if you were in that room with two other people who saw the smoke, looked at it, and then went right back to their surveys as if nothing was happening? This was another brilliant experiment by Latane and Darley, the pioneers of bystander research. They wanted to isolate the specific social forces that prevent people from acting in an emergency. This time, the potential danger was not to a stranger in another room, but directly to the participant themselves. When participants were alone in the room, their behavior was rational and swift. Over 75% of them reported the smoke within 2 minutes, long before it became a serious hazard. But the results changed dramatically when actors were introduced. When the real participant was in the room with two passive Confederates who were instructed to ignore the smoke, the participants' behavior was shockingly different. Only 10% of these participants reported the smoke. The other 90% stayed put, continuing to fill out their forms for the full 6-minute duration of the experiment, even as the room filled with so much smoke that it obscured their vision and made them cough. When interviewed later, these participants didn't seem to think it was an emergency. They rationalized the smoke as steam, air conditioning vapor, or even truth gas. But their inaction wasn't due to a lack of concern. It was due to a powerful social mechanism called pluralistic ignorance. In an ambiguous situation, we look to others for cues on how to react. Each person in that room saw the smoke and was likely internally alarmed, but they also saw that nobody else was reacting. So each person concluded, since nobody else is panicking, it must not be a real emergency. This creates a collective illusion where everyone is misleading everyone else through their outward calmness. The desire not to overreact, not to look foolish or break social norms, was so powerful that it overrode the basic instinct of self-preservation. It shows that sometimes the most dangerous thing in a room isn't the fire, but the social pressure to pretend it doesn't exist. The Good Samaritan Experiment. Does being a religious, moral person make you more likely to help someone in need? Do you become a better person by actively thinking about ethics and compassion? In 1973, psychologists John Darley and Daniel Batson decided to test this at the Princeton Theological Seminary. Their subjects were the next generation of ministers, people who had dedicated their lives to spiritual and moral principles. The experiment they designed was a modern-day reenactment of the very parable they asked the students to study, the story of the Good Samaritan. The seminary students were told they needed to prepare a short talk. Some were assigned the topic of the Good Samaritan parable, while others were given a neutral topic about job prospects for seminary graduates. After preparing their talk, each student was told to walk to a nearby building to record it. This is where the real experiment began. Along the way, each student encountered a man, an actor, slumped in a doorway, head down, eyes closed, coughing and groaning. He was clearly in distress. The question was, who would stop to help? The psychologists were testing two main variables. First, would thinking about the Good Samaritan parable make someone more likely to act like one? Second, they introduced a more mundane variable, time pressure. Some students were told, "Oh, you're late. They're expecting you a few minutes ago. You better get moving." Others were told, "It'll be a few minutes before they're ready for you, but you might as well head on over." The results were a powerful indictment of human priorities. Whether or not a student had just been meditating on the importance of helping a stranger had no statistically significant effect on their behavior. The single most powerful factor determining whether someone would stop and help was simply how much of a hurry they were in. Of the students who were in a low-hurry situation, 63% stopped to help the man. Of those in a medium hurry, 45% stopped. And of the students who'd been told they were late, only a shocking 10% stopped to offer aid. Some of them literally stepped over the suffering man on their way to give a talk about the Good Samaritan. The experiment doesn't suggest that seminary students are bad people. It suggests that all of us, no matter our beliefs or intentions, are profoundly influenced by situational pressures. Abstract moral principles are a luxury, easily discarded when we are faced with the concrete, immediate pressure of a deadline. The path to good intentions, it seems, is easily blocked by a ticking clock. The third wave experiment. How could the German people, a civilized and educated populace, claim to have been ignorant of the atrocities of the Holocaust? In 1967, Ron Jones, a history teacher at Cubberley High School in Palo Alto, California, was struggling to answer this question for his 10th grade students. Their dismissive attitude that it couldn't happen here frustrated him. So he decided to stop lecturing and start an experiment. He wanted to show them, not just tell them, the appeal of fascism. On the Monday, he began a movement he called the Third Wave. He started with simple discipline. He demanded students sit at attention, use Mr. Jones when addressing him, and stand to ask or answer questions in a clipped, formal manner. He drilled them until the responses were automatic. The students, initially bemused, quickly embraced the new structure. On Tuesday, he extended the concept to the idea of community. He had them chant in unison, strength through discipline, strength through community. He created a salute, a cupped hand brought across the chest, and made it mandatory for members both inside and outside the classroom. The class, once a collection of individuals, was now a cohesive, motivated unit. On Wednesday, he introduced action. He issued membership cards, with some marked with a red X, giving them the duty of reporting anyone who violated the movement's rules. The social dynamics of the class transformed. Students who had been leaders were hesitant, while those who were typically quiet or unpopular became the most zealous and loyal members, finally feeling like they were part of something important. The movement began to take on a life of its own, spreading through the school. By the end of the day, he had over 200 students enrolled. By Thursday, the situation was spiraling out of control. The students' commitment was absolute and frightening. They were reporting on their peers for minor infractions. Jones realized the experiment had gone too far. He had created the very mindset he had set out to condemn. He knew he had to end it. He announced to his students that the third wave was not just a class exercise, but a nationwide youth movement, and that on Friday, a national presidential candidate would announce its formation on television. On Friday, the students gathered in the auditorium, their faces filled with anticipation. The room was tense, filled with third wave banners and saluting members. He turned on a television which showed only static. After a few minutes of nervous silence, he turned it off. He revealed the truth. There was no movement, no leader. They had been part of an experiment in fascism. He then played a film about the rise of Nazi Germany, showing the rallies, the salutes, the conformity. He told them, "You would have been good Germans." The students were stunned, many of them in tears, finally understanding the lesson he had tried to teach them. The experiment proved that the seeds of fascism, the desire for order, for community, for a sense of purpose, lie dormant in even the most ordinary of settings, waiting only for the right conditions to be brought to life.